Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I have this pleasant duty to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor David Day. I think Belinda has shared with you already that Professor has done a lot of work in the area of leadership development, many years. So much so, I believe that his outstanding contributions to this research were recognized when he was awarded the Walter F. Almer Research Award by the Center for Creative Leadership in 2010. In fact, I also found out that Professor David Day is no stranger to our shores because he was a teacher in SMU sometime in 2006. So he is actually very familiar with the environment. And when we spoke this morning, I was so happy to hear him use words like same, copy o. Wow, we connected immediately. It was really good. I believe that in schools, we're always trying to look for ways to lead our teachers in the best possible approach, right? The language that we use, the positive words. And I understand that it's all about the journey. We really have not, I must say, acquired that language or even that vocabulary, and we are always learning. So we truly look forward to hear what Professor has to say about the language of leadership. And his topic of the presentation is the very theme of our conference, language of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Professor David Day.
It's wonderful to be back in Singapore. As Rashida was saying, I had the pleasure and the privilege of living here in 2006 to 2008 and was a professor at Singapore Management University. So it was nice to make the return trip to Singapore, get off the airplane in lovely Changi Airport, come into Singapore and find everything was exactly the same as when I left. He makes joke, right? Because we know one thing about Singapore, you shut your eyes for too long, everything's different, right? It's kind of a microcosm of what a lot of leaders are facing in a lot of areas. The constant change, the volatility of change and the rate of change. And so what I want to talk about today relates to that topic of how do you develop leaders and how do you develop leadership capacity to adapt to such turbulent times? And what's the role of language in all of that? So my background is as an organizational psychologist, and I focus on studying leadership and leadership development. So I'm a professor, and you know what that means? It means the occupational hazard of a professor is we like to profess. And I've got the dead zone here after lunch. So I don't have any improv or anything like that. If you do, close your eyes. Please try not to snore too loud. But other than that, I'm hoping you'll find what I have to say to be engaging, interesting, and relative to your own context and situations. So I work in an academic environment like you do, a learning environment. Schools are learning communities that are based on language. It's a very set assumption. And we know that leaders can shape, alter, and change existing language rules. So a question for you all to start this talk is, if leaders can alter the shape of language in their communities, what kind of language leader do you want to be? So just think about that. What kind of language leader do you want to be? And we'll see if that idea changes from now until about an hour when my presentation is over. So the topic is developing the language of leadership. There's a third L in this, so think about 3 L's. There's language, there's leadership, and another theme, which is a theme to any academic school environment, it's learning. And those 3 L's reinforce each other around learning, language, and leadership. What I want to do before getting into some of the ideas in the talk is to give you a bit of an overview of the context from which I come from. I'm an academic. I teach in a college in Southern California, and it might be one of the best undergraduate colleges that you never heard of. So Claremont McKenna College. How many of you have heard of Claremont McKenna College? Wow, less than half. Okay. All right, Claremont McKenna College is in Southern California, about 35 miles east of Los Angeles, or as the locals say, 35 miles east of Los Angeles, or about 4 hours by car. Not an exaggeration some days either. But Claremont McKenna is part of the Claremont Colleges, and it's a unique arrangement in the US, and it's the only one of its type, in that we have 5 Cs, 5 colleges there that are all co-located in Claremont, California. There's Claremont McKenna, there's Pomona College, there's Harvey Mudd College, there's Scripps College, which is an all-women's college, and there's Pitzer College. And so these colleges literally share the space. They all have their own campuses, but they are contiguous to each other. And students who enroll in any of the 5 Cs, any of these elite undergraduate institutions, can take classes in any of the other ones. So it creates this kind of synergy across colleges that you don't find anywhere else in the US. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight was this notion of what is our mission. To educate students for thoughtful and productive lives and responsible leadership in business, government, professions that contribute to intellectual vitality and understanding of public policy issues. And it's not too surprising, given that mission, that even though it's a liberal arts college, it focuses heavily on economics, on government, and on psychology. So within Claremont McKenna College, I'm the academic director of the Kravis Leadership Institute. And the Kravis Leadership Institute is one of 11 research institutes in this very small educational environment. So it's an opportunity, and they're there as a way for our students to get research experience in whatever domains they're interested in. The KLI, or Kravis Leadership Institute, is funded generously by Henry Kravis, who is in the class of '67. And Henry Kravis is the co-founder, co-CEO, co-chairman of Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. And the Roberts is George Roberts, his cousin, who is also a Claremont McKenna class of '67 graduate. So we're fortunate, and I like to say at CMC, Claremont McKenna, it's better to be lucky than good, because if you've got alumni like Henry Kravis and George Roberts, some of the most famous and wealthy investment bankers in the world, it makes your job a lot easier, having been in state-funded education for a lot of years. So within KLI, we're the largest institute on campus. We have a function that is research around leadership and leadership development. Another function that's on education, what we call curricular education, which is for-credit education, and there are courses that are developed and offered on leadership, leadership development, and so forth. Co-curricular programs, which are non-credit educational opportunities, and then internships. So I oversee a staff of 7, and we have about 100 students who are employees of KLI. So you can see what the mission is there in terms of the promotion and understanding of responsible, innovative leadership, consistent with the mission of the college. The next slide I want to show you is something that we've worked on since I joined CMC in 2017, which is a competency model. And I'm not sure how well that translates back to where you are, but I want to show this because of how we use this to shape the language of leadership around our campus in a number of domains. Now, competency models you may or may not be familiar with, they tend to be used in organizations as kind of forward-looking documents to identify what we need to develop in future leaders. Our competency model is quite different. It's really about developing three values in our students. The values of courage, creativity, and collaboration. And so what these values really represent is our efforts at character development. And we use those terms of developing the character of our students at Claremont McKenna. Now, underneath each of these competencies or values are three what we call capabilities. And these are things that are more, I think they're broader than skills. There may be bundles of skills, but they're things that we are developing assessments for so we can track our students over time on a number of things. So if you look under leading courageously, and by the way, the colors are not meaningful in any way, it's just a way to try to distinguish things. So if we talk about leading courageously, it's really the courage to take risks and act boldly, to behave in accordance with one's values, and to bounce back and to learn from setbacks. Now, this is one language lesson right here. We originally put failure instead of setbacks. Resilience, the courage to bounce back and learn from failure. The students were like, meh, the parents hated it. Parents, no, my kid is not going to fail. Failure has a lot of baggage with it. But if you talk about setbacks, everybody has setbacks. What do you do once you've had a setback? That's really the essence of resilience. So notice just a subtle shift or shading in the language can make a big difference in terms of how receptive people are to your leadership target, really. So under leading creatively, it's the creativity to overcome challenges, to be innovative and spark changes, and to communicate and engage with others creatively, especially those different from you. And we heard that from the minister this morning about engaging with others who are different from you, which relates to also this third competency value about collaboration and leading collaboratively. Collaborating to build meaningful relationships, to understand others' perspectives, and to work toward shared team solutions. So one of the things that's embedded in this particular approach that is not obvious from looking at it is a shift from an individual to a dyad or a small group to a collective. And I think this is an important message around development. Are you developing individuals? Are you developing people, teams of two working together, or a broader collective? And what does that mean? So that was just to give you a little bit of context of the academic environment that I work in. And this competency model is used to guide everything that we do, from curricular design to programs and program evaluation to also building assessments, so we can track our students over time and chart and understand their trajectories of development, their trajectories, how they change over time in a quantitative manner. And what we also are looking for is how to extend this beyond the students to our alums and to engage with them as lifelong learners and developers. So I say this not as this is what you should do, because I don't believe that. I believe what you need to do is local to your particular context. But think about ways that you can try to shape how students and staff think about this very ambiguous term of leadership. So let me give you an overview of this particular talk today as kind of a long wind-up. I want to address a few questions about what do we know about leadership. Examine a few commonly asked questions about leadership and development. And these are questions that you've probably maybe have asked yourself, maybe you've wrestled with, maybe you've already heard people address them. But these five questions I want to address. The first one is leadership an art or a science? Question one. Are leaders born or made? A common one, a popular one. Is developing leaders the same as developing leadership? Is leadership based on a formal position and authority? And finally, is leadership rare and exclusive? So these are 5 questions that are kind of embedded in the talk as it goes forward, but really the goal is to answer those questions and to identify how they inform practice. How do the answers to these questions help us better develop leaders and leadership? And what is the role of language in all of this? As one of the things that supports learning and supports leadership. And how do we enhance the capacity of individuals and collectives to develop their leadership? So this is where we're going, and I want to launch into this with a quote that I think, from what I've heard the minister talk about this morning and from what I heard our friends at the Design Center talk about, it's really what's the 21st century leadership imperative. And this is a quote from Peter Drucker. How many of you have heard of Peter Drucker? Okay. More have heard of Peter Drucker than Claremont McKenna, but ironically, Peter Drucker was a prof at Claremont Graduate University, which is right across the street from Claremont McKenna. So you didn't even know, did you? Now you do. Now you do. So Peter Drucker was obviously this very influential management thinker, and he was very prescient in terms of the future of management. And he talked about what's the 21st century imperative for management and leadership. And he said that the traditional organization, the one of the last 100 years, the skeleton or internal structure was a combination of rank and power. In the emerging organization, it has to be mutual understanding and responsibility. Not that it should be or could be or might be, it has to be mutual understanding and responsibility. Why would he say that? And something to reflect on is to what degree your organizations are based on a 20th century internal structure of rank and power, or do they operate under mutual understanding and responsibility? I think that what Drucker was talking about dealt with this notion of change and complexity. The complexity of our environments are such that no single leader can figure it all out. They need to rely on others, and they need to rely on developing others to take responsibility for leadership, to be a leader even when they cannot be the leader, and help to develop this notion of mutual understanding. So we are aligned in our thinking about the challenges and threats in our environments. And you think about mutual understanding. Can you have mutual understanding without language? No, I think it is impossible to have mutual understanding without language. Are we speaking the same language? I'm not talking about speaking in the same dialect, but really, are we speaking the same organizational language? And this is where I think the 21st century leadership imperative is, moving from rank and power to this notion of mutual responsibility and understanding. So we'll take this to our first question. Is leadership an art or a science? Trick question. It's not either or, it's and both, right? And both, not either or. So I've spent the last 30 plus years researching leadership and leadership development, and I'll be the first to tell you, you don't want me leading your organization. And trust me, some of the people at Kravis Leadership Institute say, we really don't, Prof, you're really smart at what you do, but, leave the actual leadership stuff to other people. How can that be? Well, the way I equate this is if you think about the scholarship of Shakespeare, all right? Think about Shakespearean scholars. Who makes the best Shakespearean scholars? Not the best Shakespearean actors. And the best Shakespearean actors don't make decent Shakespearean scholars. But they can learn from each other. There is an art and a science to this. And we know from leadership that there is 100 years of research. We don't know everything about leadership because it's based in people and people interacting. And I hope we never do understand everything about leadership because that would be pretty depressing. We would be automatons or robots. But we know some things. And I think educating, practicing leaders on evidence about what they do is an imperative for high-quality leadership. And those of us who work in the science can learn about how people enact some of the science in terms of becoming effective leaders. And one of the keys, I think, relates to a riddle. How is leadership like playing the piano? How is like leadership playing the piano? Well, there's an old sawhorse of a joke that Americans like to tell where a tourist from Singapore in New York City stops somebody, stops a taxi driver. Hey, taxi. Well, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, right? So the same goes for leadership. Now, in terms of how's that like playing the piano, I can learn how to play scales, I can learn how to play the notes, but what distinguishes a world-class concert pianist from somebody who plays in the lobby of a hotel bar? They're able to translate their emotions into their music in a way that connects with people. And I think that's also quite true of leaders, really good, effective, world-class leaders. So the other question is one that you get all the time. Are leaders born or made? So how many of you think leaders are born? Raise your hand. Nobody? You're all wrong. Okay, one. We got one gentleman right here. You're all wrong. Why? Never met a leader who has not been born. Have you? Tell me. Met the leader who has not been born? In vitro leadership. Of course, it's another trick question. It's not either or, it's and both. So research has actually been done on some of the genetic components to leadership, and there are some. Inherited capacity for leadership. Researchers have estimated that it's about 25 to 30% of the variance in relevant leadership outcomes can be explained by inherited genetic factors. And these factors are things that there's not a leadership gene yet, well, let's hope not, ever, but things like personality and intelligence and even height. Whether you're male or female, height is associated at least with leadership emergence. That doesn't mean that, short people got nothing, right? It just means that they may have to work harder to be seen as others in their environments. But the other thing about this whole made versus born thing is like we know a lot of people who were born with potential. They had a lot of potential for a domain. Maybe they had a lot of potential in music, or a lot of potential in sport, or a lot of potential in business or leadership, and they never did anything with it. Your potential take you only so far. If you don't develop your potential, you waste your potential. It's a classic use it or lose it. And to a large degree, something that I'll explore with you as the talk proceeds, leadership is a choice. Leadership is a choice. It's not destiny, it's a choice. Do you choose to be a leader? But a lot of our mindsets get in the way of what we think is an effective leader. For example, let me show you a slide. It's called I call it the romance of leadership. And you look at the slide and you're like, okay, yeah, that matches my image of an effective leader. Now, I would guess that 99% of you are looking at the man on the horse. Who's the real leader? It's the horse. Have you ever gone horseback riding? I have gone I'm no cowboy, but I've gone horseback riding, and let me tell you, when those horses make the turn and they see that barn, you are not the leader, because they are charging for that barn no matter what you do, right? But yeah, our mindsets are, we see this warrior on a horse, and the leader, of course, must be this, in this case, and oftentimes is the case, this man, Napoleon. You know what happened to him, right? But we have leader-centric, heroic, romantic notions of leadership. Our leaders will save us. And this seems to be part of our implicit leadership theories. This is actual scientific term, implicit leadership theories, where there is a leader who will save us, rescue us, lead us out of trouble. And we think that this is some hypothetical, that this doesn't exist. There is a current US president, whose name will not be mentioned, ran on the platform of only I can fix this, and people believed him. The days are gone that only I can fix this, right? But yet, our mindsets are still, when we think leader, we think hero. And oftentimes, the research that was just published in the Academy Management Journal confirmed that we also tend to think, when we think leader, we think male. So here's another picture for you. Penguin leadership. Penguin leadership. So I don't know why penguins get associated with leadership all the time, but if you Google leadership and go to images, you get penguins and leadership. I don't get it, right? And the way we tend to think, of course, is that there's the leader, they're diving into the water, and these blokes are just going to follow in behind him, right? This is the overlay that we put onto the picture. Now, what do we know about penguins, really? Penguins are disreputable characters, or jerks, depending on how you want to frame it. Your language. And I know this. This is a scientific fact. This is a scientific fact. And it was a fact that was observed through observation by some of the Antarctic explorers in the turn of the 20th century, particularly the disastrous Robert Falcon Scott expedition, and it's codified in a book called The Worst Journey in the World. And what they observed about penguins was this. Well, first of all, again, we tend to look at the water. We look at the water, and we think swimming pool. They're going to go in and swim. Penguin looks at water, and what do they think? Dining hall, dining room, right? Because they have to go in the water in order to feed. And so what you're looking at here is not the leader. What you're looking at is the hungriest penguin. Because these penguins, the hungriest penguin, will walk up to the edge, and I don't want to get too close here because I might do a header. They will walk up to the edge and look down in the water, because what's also in the water besides food? Sharks, leopard seals, things that will eat them, right? Right. So there's danger in there, as well as they got to be in there, but they got to be careful. So why are penguins or jerks? These guys, this guy here probably, they come up behind the hungriest penguin, give him a little boot, give him a little shoulder, give him a little nudge. And then they'd look over and they say, did he get eaten or not? If he didn't get eaten, they all go in. If he did, they all go, maybe next time. But when we look at this picture, we tend to see something very different, and that narrative is incorrect. So how we visualize leadership matters, and it can limit us in terms of how we enact leadership. So since we're in the wild kingdom, I want to give you another one, and this comes from science. This is an article published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society Biology about leadership in elephants. So whereas penguins are disreputable characters, elephants are noble creatures. Truly noble creatures that have very complex social orders, complex societies. And I don't know if you know this, but herds of elephants are organized around a matriarchy. That the oldest, most experienced female leader is the one, female elephant is the one who is the leader of the herd. Now, what happened to all the boy elephants? What happened to all the bulls? Well, they stay with the herd until they're teenagers. And then either they leave or they're kicked out. but I don't know where they go, join the circus, they go to Mardi Gras, I don't know where they go, but they leave. And the bull elephants live very solitary lives, but the female elephants all stick together throughout their lives. And as I said, they have a very complex social structure. Now, what this research was looking at, and it's an ingenious field experiment. I really wish that I had been a researcher on this. I think it's a really cool study, but I'm a psychologist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a zoologist. So here's what they did. They wanted to look at, as the title says, what's the adaptive value of age in terms of the matriarchal leader in herds of elephants? Is there an advantage for being older and wiser, as we would think, among this particular species? So what they did was an experiment where they manipulated the threat that these herds would experience through a playback system. And the only thing other than man that's a real threat to elephants is lions. Although, you know what they're really petrified of? Anybody know? Elephants are petrified of bees. Petrified of bees. I know, what? It's a little bit, but you think about it, they can get into their eyes. And that's one way to really traumatize an elephant. But what they did was manipulate the playback protocol around lions. Male lions are more of a threat than female lions. Bigger numbers of lions are more of a threat than sole lions. So what they did was they manipulated that like good experimenters and looked at the reactions of the matriarch in the herd in terms of how much attention was paid to the threat by the ears going up, and then also by the bunching activity that they initiated through their language. And their language is a very low decibel language that most of us can't hear, but the bunching is important because what's more dangerous than one elephant? A bunch of elephants, right? So it's a way of protecting not only the young, but it's also a way of protecting the matriarch. And the matriarch needs to be protecting because the theory is they have all this wisdom. They have all of this experience. So I've actually got a brief video that I want to show you from this experiment. So I want you to pay attention to what goes on in terms of the attention to the threat, the bunching activity, and then identify who's the leader. Who's the leader? Go to the video. Well, we practiced this and it went off without a hit. There we go. It's only about 1:50. So who's the leader? Who's the leader?
Bunching.
Here's the bunching. Okay, so what you saw was both attending to the threat. Can you play it one more time? Attending to the threat is also this bunching behavior. Now, which is the leader? Which is the leader? Wait till it zooms in. Okay, most people would say that is the leader, and that would be incorrect. That is the leader. And you can tell because of the size of the tusks. Bigger tusks, older elephant. But notice that this elephant is not at the front. But again, this is how we think about leadership. You got to be at the front. This is actually an excellent example of leading from behind. Leading from behind to shepherd your flock, your herd, away from a threat. And that elephant, actually, it's at a game preserve in Kenya. Her name is Joyce. She has a name, and she's 66 years old. 66 years old. And that's another remarkable thing about elephants is that they remain very active and vital to their herds even in post-reproductive life. And so what these researchers found was exactly what they hypothesized, which is the older the elephant, the more experienced the matriarch, the more that they would attune to the threat when it was appropriate, when the threat was the largest, either a male lion or multiple lions, and also be faster at getting their herd to bunch it together. Now, we didn't hear this matriarch bringing this herd together, but she was using elephant language to do that. So we can learn a lot about leadership in other species, but we have to break the frame of how we typically think about leadership as being very romanticized, heroic, and also leader-centric. Next question, is developing leaders the same as developing leadership? And this is one where language matters, but it's not just a matter of semantics. Developing leaders is different from developing leadership. Often you hear the term leadership development, and it's really about developing leaders. And what typically happens is that an individual is sent to some offsite to develop their leadership skills for a day, 3 days, half day, 5 days, whatever. And then they come back to their organizations and are thought to be better leaders, right? Thought to be better leaders. There's a flaw in that logic. Change management 101. Sending a changed person back to an unchanged system is a recipe in futility. And a lot of what is spent in terms of developing leaders is wasted. We like to say, half of it is wasted, we just don't know which half, right? Because they go back into a system, and who should be their biggest supporter? Their biggest source of support should be their boss. But what does the boss say? What? You want to do what? No. We do it the old way. And so the person gets frustrated. They regress to what they did before. All that learning is lost. And if they get really frustrated, they quit. So when you send somebody to a leader development program, 3 things can happen, 2 of which are bad, unless you work on changing the context, changing the system that they return to. So I just have a very brief slide here. We see this all the time. You know, you Google leadership and you get these kinds of pictures, right? Very interesting in that 1, 2, 3 are male. It's representative. 3 of them are male, 2 of them are red. I don't know if that means anything. And 2 of them go like this. So, draw your own inference. However, what the takeaway is look at how leadership is conceptualized. Not in these people, those people, that person, that person, that person. If we really want to move to 21st century leadership, we need to move away from these romanticized, heroic, leader-centric notions to developing a broader capacity for leadership and both perspectives. So here's my one academic slide of definitions. So we're talking about leader development, and I want to emphasize leader development is important. It's not that we should do away with it. We just need to do it better. So leader development is the expansion of the capacity of individuals to be effective in leadership roles and processes, whether they're formal or informal leadership roles and processes. It's really a human capital imperative because it's focused on knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, competencies, okay? Things that can be internalized within a person, can be learned within a person. But leadership development is the growth or the expansion of a collective's capacity to produce leadership. And that requires a shifting in the frame from human capital to social capital. Because social capital is all about the connections between people. It's all about the relationships, that form. And we know that there, from the research that's done on social capital, there is value to relationships. And the collectives that we are embedded in would benefit from having stronger connections and relationships to people, because there would be greater capacity to produce leadership when that leadership is most needed. The connection to language is that they can affect both how individuals develop and collectives develop. And of course, the touchstone for development is really about learning. So I have an academic, a wonky slide here from some of my own research. I told you, occupational hazard of a professor, you profess, and you profess your own work over others for the most part. So I just want to show you this one slide that was published in the annual review of organizational psychology and organizational behavior. That's a conceptual model that's trying to say, what is it that we're trying to develop when we develop leaders and develop leaderships? And they're leaderships. I'm Singaporean, and leaderships. So two things that are embedded in here. One are levels of analysis, individual, collective, and the other one is time. This is often overlooked in development. What's the time scale for which things will develop? And we tend to think we do some kind of training or development and we have some improvement later on. Improvement in what? And it ignores the fact, and this is a truism from science of development. People start at different places and change in different ways in their developmental trajectories. So they bring into any context different capabilities. So it's not that the intervention drives development, it's the intervention molds or shapes the capabilities into outcomes. And this is just very crude proximal distal outcomes. Proximal outcomes are things that we can use as indicators that development is likely happening, but they're more likely to change more quickly than these distal outcomes. So things like leadership self-efficacy, how confident I am to act like a leader, my self-awareness, which has been a touchstone of a lot of effective and ineffective leadership. The leadership KSAs, the knowledge, skills, abilities, right? So skills are not unimportant, but they're things that are going to develop more likely in the short term. And this one, which is really important, I think, leader identity. To what extent do you internalize an identity of being a leader as part of your development? And the reason why that's important, and I'll come back to this, is that identity drives resource allocation. You do what's important or you think is important for you, and you don't do things that you don't think are important for you. And so how many of you played a musical instrument as a youth? Raise your hands. I would expect more. You've already repressed that. All those lessons, all that. Usually that I want to ask you how many play now, because that's going to be a really small number. But what happens, of course, is that we all start off playing some musical instrument. Mom, dad, whatever makes us play the music. School makes us play the musical instrument, right? But then we get interested in sport. We say, I don't want to play violin. I want to play basketball. And so you nag. Okay, go play basketball. And the violin goes into the closet, right? And the reason is that your identity is, I'm not a violin player. I'm a basketball player. And that's where you devote your resources. So identity is important for resource allocation. Now, if there's something that's missing here are feedback loops from these proximal indicators back to capabilities. But over the long term, and this is another reason why identity is important, over the long term, you need to invest in your own development. And that identity piece is what motivates practice over longer periods of time, which raises the question, how do you practice your leadership? Well, I'll hold on to that one for a second. But over the longer time, these proximal things are shaped into long-term changes in actually the operating system of you as a human being. I'll just put it that way, your operating system. Your mindsets, your worldviews, the way that, how sophisticated you think about things changes with practice and support over longer periods of time, but the needle moves much more slowly than they do for the proximal indicators. And a similar process happens at the collective level, where you put people into some collective. So there's the link here. The experiences and interventions shape that capability of the group into some proximal indicators. And one of the big ones that I'll elaborate on is this notion of psychological safety. Psychological safety. Do you feel safe taking an interpersonal risk in your collective? By saying, I don't understand, I don't know, I think that might be wrong. Do you feel safe doing that? If you do not feel safe doing that, how can you expect learning to occur? And the answer is, it's not going to happen. But things like psychological safety, transactive memory, which is understanding what other people know and their expertise, shared mindsets, team learning, which are shaped again through intensive interpersonal interactions over time into something we call collective leadership capacity. And yes, and both, not either or. And what organizations are pretty, what they invest a lot in now is up here, this. Very few invest in that because, one, they don't understand it because it's not consistent with their mindset. And the other reason is that it really gets into changing culture and changing the culture of the collective, whether it's an entire organization, whether it's a department, whether it's a team. You have different rules of engagement. Next question. Is leadership based on a formal position and authority? Well, we all know that being in a leadership role or a leadership position does not guarantee that someone provides leadership. And one reason is that if you rely completely on your authority, all you're doing is ordering people around. You're not really engaging in leadership. But the thing that's even more important here is it ignores the fact that we are all leaders and followers. Leadership is a dynamic process. It's not a dichotomy of leaders and followers. Even the most senior leaders have to follow sometime, and they'll tell you that. They have to follow their board. They have to follow regulations. They have to follow government. They have to follow their investors. So some people may be leaders more than they are followers. Some people may be followers more than they are leaders, but we are all both leaders and followers. And we need to figure out when is the right time for us to be leaders and when is the right time for us to be followers. Because we know too many leaders who think they're doing the right thing need to just shut up and stand back, right? And listen to what's going on around them. Would be the most effective thing they could do as a leader. Think about our elephant friends. When they see a threat, what did they do? They stopped and they listened. I think listening is one of the most overlooked leadership skills that there is. Work on it. So, as I noted, leadership is a choice. It's not destiny, but with choice comes responsibility. And one of the biggest responsibilities is to develop yourself, to prepare yourself so you're ready to contribute effectively when a leadership moment arises. How can you be a leader even if you can't be the leader? So I'm getting in the home stretch here, and good, we'll have some time for Q&A. I hope you're still awake out there. I don't hear any snoring, so all good. Is leadership rare and exclusive? Now, this is one that really irritates me, because if you talk to a lot of corporate organizations in particular, they would think so, because most corporates have what are called high potential leadership development programs. high potential leadership development programs. They identify who are their high potential leaders, supposedly, and invest disproportionately in their development. So what do you think the average percent of people in a corporate organization who are designated as high potential? 50%? 20%? How about 3 to 5%? So if you're not high potential, what are you? No potential? Low potential? How'd you like that one on your desk? Oh, there's Mark, Mr. Low Potential. No, I think about the language underneath the message, right? So is there a way of moving from this very rare and exclusive perspective on leadership to an everyone culture where everyone can be developed? Now, it doesn't mean everyone's going to run the company. And there's some mindset. It's like, oh, everybody's a chief who's going to be the Indians, right? But it's not about that. It's really about developing people to their full potential. And the research, I'm not a big fan of generational research, saying the millennials do this and the boomers do that. But millennials do tend to endorse the notion of they want work environments where they have the opportunity to grow and to develop. And if you are only investing in the so-called high potentials, you're going to lose a lot of talent. And by the way, there's this whole other secret. I've worked with a number of corporates around these things. They're terrible at identifying potential. They're absolutely awful. They think they know what they're doing, but it comes down to subjective judgment. Most corporates use a version of what's called the 9 box, where they plot your performance against your potential. That 9 box really looks more like the performance against performance matrix. And because research will support this, psychological research, we're not very good at identifying potential. So how can anyone become better at their leadership? It's back to the Carnegie Hall thing. Practice, practice, practice. We know from the voluminous research on expert performance and expertise that it takes a minimum of 10 years, 10,000 hours to develop to an expert status in any domain. That's sport, music, games, even some technical skills. I think the same is with leadership. And you're not going to get that by going to some one-off event. You really have to invest in it in the long term. And even if you weren't the one who was blessed with all the potential to be a leader, you can still become better at it if it's important to you, it's part of your identity, and you invest in practicing your leadership. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you will end up running a country or a company or even a school, but you will be more effective in contributing to your collective if you invest in your potential to be a leader. So here are the core principles of leader development, and these are available to anyone. Experience drives leader development, especially challenging experiences, where there's a possibility of setback, possibility of setback, not failure, possibility of setbacks. You need to own your development and don't expect people to develop you. That's also something that I work with young leaders around. You've got to own your development and learn how to leverage your experiences to learn from them. It's not so much having an experience, because what is not an experience is how do you learn from those experiences. So experience drives a lot of development. Practice helps to develop certain KSAs. It can help to enhance your self-efficacy as a leader. It can contribute in a kind of a spiral to you internalizing more of a leader identity. But it takes a long time to do it. This is not something that happens on a weekend. It's really more of a lifelong investment in something that matters a lot to you and can be a difference maker, by the way, in your career. Identity motivates practice, especially over the long term, and I've noted this notion about resource allocation. And feedback. This is something, and it's grounded in language. Feedback is a gift, and we should be giving more gifts to each other. But when I say feedback, you probably think, what? No bad stuff coming. Think about how many times someone in your group, your collective, does something really good, and you just ignore it. It's kind of expected. What's keeping you from giving positive feedback? Oh, they'll take advantage of it. They get lazy. No, but that's not what happens. The research suggests that's not what happens. If people get positive feedback, they're more likely to repeat what they do when they get positive feedback, right? So when you want to practice and build on feedback, practice giving positive feedback to people. You know, think, oh, they just think I'm trying to get in good with them. I'm trying to ingratiate myself to them. Trust me, I'm a psychologist. People have a really high threshold for ingratiation. It takes a lot for them to start thinking it's fake, all right? So by giving positive feedback and giving it in a positive way, what you will do is, one, start to build trust with another person. Start to build trust. Because that person will then come to you maybe when they feel that things are not going all that well, and will look to you for feedback and support in helping them address that challenge. So this notion of using language as a support mechanism. Leadership development researchers at the Center for Creative Leadership, where I've worked considerably, talk about any experience can be made more developmental to the extent that it incorporates assessment, challenge, and support. Assessment, challenge, and support. So if any one of those three is missing, the developmental punch drops enormously. So I want to end by talking about someone else's work, but I think it's really remarkable work. And if there's one book I can recommend to put on your reading list in the near future, it's this one by Robert Key and Lisa Lacy. They're educational psychologists at Harvard, and they've both done a lot of work around adult development and understanding what's called constructive developmental theory, how we move from relatively unsophisticated to more sophisticated ways of thinking and understanding the world. And so they had this book called An Everyone Culture, Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization. And I'll unpack this a little bit for you, but I don't want to unpack too much of it because I want you to read the book. It really is worth the investment. And even if you say, well, I'm in this school, I'm in this job, I'm in this company, it's not a deliberately developmental organization, but what can you do to nudge it in that direction? What can you do to move it in that direction, even if you can't have it all right away? So what's involved in being a deliberately developmental organization? Well, three things, and they talk about, and these are their labels: home, groove, and edge, which is relating to the depth of the community, the breadth of the developmental practices, and the height of the developmental aspirations. And if you think about that, those of you who teach science, those are the parameters of what? Volume, capacity. So they're really talking about investing in a capacity for development. And they don't talk that much about leader development or leadership development, but it could relate to that. It does relate to that. So in your collectives, in your communities, let's talk about what is, home, groove, and edge. So the home deals with the community that you're in. And in a 21st century leadership paradigm, rank does not have its usual privileges. There is more of a level playing ground. Now, granted, there are differences in rank, and more senior ranks have more responsibility, but it doesn't mean that they get more goodies, and especially that they don't get more goodies at the expense of people who are at lower levels. Everyone invests in the development of people around them. You are responsible not only for your development, but for your development and your development. How can you do that? Well, feedback is a good place to start, and everyone builds the culture. One of the companies that's featured in this book is Bridgewater. And Bridgewater is the largest hedge fund in the world, run by this iconic guy, Ray Dalio. But one of the things that Dalio has embedded in Bridgewater is radical transparency. Radical transparency. For example, every meeting at Bridgewater is videotaped, and anyone in the organization can watch it. What? Well, the theory is that the thinking, the principle, and you might have heard of Dalio's principles, and this is one of them, is like we spend so much time at work hiding our weaknesses, hiding our shortcomings from other people. We're afraid that we're going to be found out. Trust me, they already know. But the other thing is, rather than trying to hide, is like, how can they help you? How can they help you develop from those weaknesses? So the practices and tools is that destabilization can be constructive. Too many so-called leaders are invested in the status quo, which means nothing changes. Why? Because they got it good in the status quo. But destabilization means change, and change means leadership. So mind the gaps between what we say and what we do. People should always be walking their talk and not just talking. And the interior part of all of this is what is really manageable. And that goes to our mindsets, how we think about things. And think back to those pictures that I showed you of penguins and Napoleon and elephants, and how that challenges different ways of thinking about leadership and ultimately talking about leadership. There's a saying in social psychology, thinking is for doing, and doing causes thinking. Thinking is for doing, doing causes thinking. So the interior part is really talking about your mental structures for making sense of the world and how sophisticated are those mental structures. And the last one is developmental aspirations. Someone mentioned Dweck's work around growth mindset. You know, it's amazing how many people still hold on to a fixed mindset that people don't change or can't change or won't change. If you're in that kind of environment, then you really would struggle to be a DDO, because one of the fundamental aspects of EDGE is that people can grow in the right context. Weakness is a potential asset. Error is an opportunity because it's an opportunity for learning. If you keep doing things right over and over and over again, there's a point of diminishing returns where you stop learning much of anything. But error means that you're kind of pushing the envelope, and it's an opportunity to learn. And what they say about bottom line is all one thing. It's not that, okay, we make a lot of money at Bridgewater, therefore we can have all of this developmental stuff. They will say, and they do say, that they are successful because they've integrated deliberately developmental principles into their business model. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to see how that could apply to schools or other kinds of educational organizations. So here's a picture that identifies those three characteristics again and shows the intersection. So working on development is challenging. Development is not easy. It's challenging, but sustained by practices over the long time, developmental practices. Practices help to nurture trustworthy community, and trustworthy community nurtures practice. And this last one, I think, is really one that I want you to reflect on, and hopefully it stays with you. Working on development requires shared vulnerability in a trustworthy community. And think about the last time you or someone else really demonstrated some sort of vulnerability to others in your collective. Too often we're into protection mode. We don't want to be looked at as limited in any way because we don't trust how others will use that information. So you need to build trust. I've told you how feedback can build trust. It needs to start somewhere. We talked about being bold, taking risks, not being worried about setbacks. You know, there's a quote from, I can't remember who the quote is from now, but it goes like, I'm only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. So I need to do the one thing that I can do, or the something that I can do. And the same thing is with you. Take the risk to show some vulnerability to a trusted colleague. And you might be amazed at what builds from there. So I want to leave you here with going back to our 5 questions and about these assumptions about language leadership, about leadership language. So we know the leadership is based on science and evidence, but it does require some linguistic performance or artistry to bring it off. And I'm not just talking about oratory skills. I'm not talking about being Martin Luther King or anything. You need to be able to connect to people with your language. Leadership is a performance art, but there's evidence that you can use in order to enhance your performance. Leaders are shaped by both nature and nurture, and both, and yes. And we know that language, we have an innate gift for language, but how we use that gift and that potential, how we develop that gift and potential is on us. And don't waste your potential. Leadership is dynamic and often an informal process that's grounded in language. And what we need to move away from is language that's grounded mainly in advocacy, advocating our position, trying to get our way, and move more towards inquiry and understanding other people's perspective. This notion of empathy that's part of our competency model at KLI and others have mentioned today. Experience drives development. The key is to learn as much as possible from challenging experiences. And learning and language are indispensable to each other. And the last one is leadership skills are widely available in any community. And developing the collective capacity for leadership requires inclusive language and shared vulnerability in a trustworthy community. So remember the 3 L's, if nothing else, about leadership, language, and learning, how they relate to each other. So I hope you put those into practice. You go forth, you use these tools in developing your capacity as individual leaders, and to also invest in developing the collective capacities of your schools and your organizations. So thank you. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions. Yes? Oh, I need to come over here. It's on the podium.
Thank you, Professor. I thought that was very insightful, and I remembered something that you said. The subtle shift in language really make the people that we lead more receptive to our leadership. And I thought that was a good takeaway for me.
Thank you.
All right, we have about 5 minutes before the next keynote speech. So are there any questions from the floor?
Hi, I'm Betty,
Hi, Becky.
Pierce Secondary School. Just a matter of interest, Professor. In the light of quite a number of leaders who have remarked upon this, I just want to hear your perspective about how gender influences the language of leadership and your perspective on having more ladies as leaders, can be in any area, corporates, industrial, as well as education. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's a great question. So I got another hour, right? I mean, there are, differences in how people communicate, and we know that gender does play a role in this, and some have argued that there is a female leadership advantage, but females are often not recognized for this advantage in terms of being more transformational. And the transformational piece really is about some things like showing individualized consideration more than, setting task demands. So the challenge is, and this is why I said, maybe we have another hour, is that, men and women, a man and a woman who demonstrate the exact same behavior or the exact same language will be viewed or tend to be viewed quite differently. And women who say very supportive, comforting kinds of things can be stereotyped as weak. And women who come across very hard-charging and directive can come, well, I'm not going to say the word, but you know the word, can come across a very different way. We're doing the exact same thing as a man. And it's not a level playing field, unfortunately. And we don't, as a psychologist, we haven't really figured out how to fix that. We keep hoping that time will change things when the next generation comes up and there's more, more experience with, dealing with the other gender in leadership kinds of roles. I don't know if this relates, it doesn't really relate, but I thought this was a very cute story that a dad took his daughter to a class paintball exercise. You know paintball, right? You go in and you shoot each other, and you live or you die or whatever, and you give yourselves names. And she gave herself the name Girl. And Dad was like, "Why girl? Why did you label yourself Girl?" He said, "Because Dad, when I kill a boy, I want to know he got killed by a girl."